The human fleet decloaked behind the Pakled armada as Captain Jeffrey Warren's fingers danced across the weapons console, arming humanity's secret kill codes implanted in the enemy computers. For years, the Galactic Council mocked humanity, calling them weak and primitive, not knowing an army of human programmers had infiltrated every Pakled system, waiting to shut them all down. On the view screen, the emergency council session devolved into chaos. Pakled Ambassador Keed spewed venomous insults, declaring humanity unfit to fight at their side. The spineless council said nothing in humanity's defense. "Sir, the Pakleds are moving to attack the Crab Nebula colonies," Lieutenant Chen reported. "Keed is ordering his ships to show no mercy." Jeffrey gritted his teeth. The arrogant council had given the Pakleds permission to seize human territory. The aliens wanted to goad humanity into a war, to have an excuse to wipe them out and plunder Earth's resources. What the Pakleds didn't know was that they were sailing into a trap. Humanity had anticipated this day for a long time. "Lieutenant, signal the fleet to prepare firing solutions," Jeffrey ordered, "and alert Earth that we are ready to engage." "Aye, sir. Should I send the kill code activation?" Jeffrey watched numbly as Pakled ships opened fire on human colonies. It was now or never. If the stealth fleet couldn't cripple the Pakleds here, then billions on Earth and across human space would burn. "Send the codes," Jeffrey said, his voice grim. "Let's show these council bastards what weak and primitive looks like." Lieutenant Chen's face was grim as he turned to Jeffrey. "Sir, we're receiving an encrypted transmission from Ghost. It's not good news." Jeffrey's brow furrowed. "Put it through." The view screen flickered, and a grainy image of a hooded figure appeared. "Captain, the situation is worse than we feared. The Pakleds have a planet killer, a weapon capable of destroying entire worlds with a single shot. I've located the power core, but it's deep within a heavily fortified space station." A heavy silence fell over the bridge. Jeffrey's mind raced, calculating the potential loss of life if the Pakleds were to unleash such a weapon. He knew what had to be done. "Ghost, send us the coordinates of that space station. We're going in." As the transmission ended, Jeffrey turned to his crew. "We have one chance to end this. We're going to infiltrate that station and destroy the power core. It's the only way to stop the planet killer and cripple the Pakled war machine." In the Galactic Council chambers, the mood was tense. Reports of the advancing Pakled fleet had reached the members, and opinions were divided. "We must surrender," one council member cried. "Resistance is futile. We cannot hope to stand against such power." Another slammed his fist on the table. "No, we must unite and fight. If we surrender now, we lose everything." Amidst the chaos, a small group of council members huddled together, whispering urgently. One of them slipped away, heading for a private communications room. On the bridge of Jeffrey's ship, a light blinked on the comms panel. "Sir, we're being hailed. It's from the Galactic Council." Jeffrey frowned. What could they want now? He nodded to Lieutenant Chen, who opened the channel. A cloaked figure appeared on the screen. "Captain Warren, I represent a faction within the Council. We believe in your cause and wish to offer our support and resources in the coming battle." Jeffrey was skeptical. "Why should I trust you?" "Because we have no choice. If the Pakleds succeed, we all lose. We're sending you encrypted data on Pakled fleet movements and weaknesses. Use it well." As the transmission ended, Jeffrey felt a chill run down his spine. Something wasn't right. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that some unseen force was pulling the strings. But there was no time for doubt. The crew prepared for the most important mission of their lives, each knowing that failure was not an option. The fate of countless lives hung in the balance. As Jeffrey and his crew rushed to prepare for their critical mission, a series of bizarre incidents began to unfold aboard the Shadow Strike. Consoles sparked and went dark without warning. Communications arrays crackled with eerie, unintelligible whispers. Crew members, their faces pale and eyes wide, spoke in hushed tones of ghostly apparitions lurking in the shadows of the ship's corridors. Jeffrey, already stretched thin by the weight of his responsibilities, found himself grappling with a growing sense of unease. In the quiet hours of the ship's night cycle, vivid nightmares haunted his sleep, visions of an alien presence worming its way into his mind, probing his deepest fears and darkest secrets. Despite the gnawing dread that threatened to consume him, Geoffrey knew that he could not falter. Too much was at stake. With a heavy heart and a sense of grim determination, he gave the order to proceed with the mission. The Shadow Strike, flanked by her sister ships, the USS Phantom and the USS Wraith, set course for the Pakled space station that housed the Planet Killer's power core. As they approached their target, the stealth fleet had to navigate a treacherous asteroid field, relying on their advanced cloaking technology to avoid detection. Tension mounted on the bridge as the ships wove through the tumbling rocks, each collision averted by mere meters. Sweat beaded on the brows of the navigation team, their hands flying across their consoles as they plotted a safe path through the chaos. Just as they emerged from the asteroid field, a massive Pakled warship materialized before them, its weapons already charged and locked onto the human fleet. Geoffrey's heart sank as he realized that the Pakleds had been waiting for them all along. The mission had been compromised from the very beginning. As the first volley of enemy fire rocked the Shadow Strike, Geoffrey's comms panel lit up with an incoming transmission from Ghost. The spy's voice was strained, barely audible over the static. "They know. They've always known. The real threat is not what you think it is." Before Geoffrey could demand an explanation, the transmission cut off abruptly, leaving him with a chilling sense of uncertainty. As the battle raged around him, the captain fought to keep his ship and crew alive, his mind racing with unanswered questions and the sinking realization that they had stumbled into a trap, far more sinister than any of them could have imagined. The Shadow Strike shuddered under the onslaught of Pakled weapons fire. Sparks flew from overloaded consoles as the ship's shields strained to absorb the brutal barrage. "Divert all power to engines and aft shields," Geoffrey shouted over the blaring alarms. "We need to draw that warship away from the Phantom and the Wraith." The helmsman's hands flew across the controls, sending the Shadow Strike into a dizzying spiral, away from the main battle. The Pakled vessel, sensing an opportunity, broke formation and gave chase, its weapons never ceasing their relentless assault. In the bowels of the ship, damage control teams raced to seal breached bulkheads and reroute power around destroyed conduits. Lieutenant Chen worked feverishly at her station, trying to unscramble Ghost's garbled transmission. "Captain, I think I've got something," she called out. "It's not clear, but it sounds like Ghost is warning us about some kind of alien threat, something even worse than the Pakleds." Geoffrey gripped the armrests of his chair as the ship rocked from another direct hit. "Keep working on it, Lieutenant. We need answers." He turned to his weapons officer. "Prepare the phase-shifting torpedo. It's time to even the odds." The officer nodded, his fingers already dancing across the launch controls. Moments later, the experimental weapon streaked away from the Shadow Strike, its casing shimmering as it passed through the Pakled ship's hull like a ghost. Inside the enemy vessel, the torpedo rematerialized, tearing through decks and bulkheads with devastating force. The warship's engines sputtered and died, leaving it dead in space. A cheer went up from the Shadow Strike's crew, but Geoffrey remained grim. They had bought time, but at a heavy cost. On the Pakled space station, Lieutenant Commander Volkov and his team crept through the eerily lit corridors, their weapons at the ready. Strange glyphs pulsed on the walls, their meaning a mystery. Organic tendrils snaked across the floor, pulsating with an unearthly rhythm. As they neared the power core chamber, a terrifying screech echoed through the halls. Volkov signaled his team to take cover just as a nightmarish creature burst from the shadows. It was a grotesque fusion of Pakled and something else, something ancient and malevolent. Its body was a mass of writhing tentacles and chitinous plates, its eyes burning with an insatiable hunger. The creature leveled a twisted appendage at the humans, a searing beam of energy lancing out towards them. Volkov dove aside, the beam missing him by inches. He rolled to his feet, his rifle already spitting plasma bolts at the monstrosity. His team joined in, pouring fire into the creature's hide. But the beast seemed to absorb the shots, its wounds closing almost as quickly as they appeared. It lunged forward, its razor-sharp claws slashing at the nearest soldier. Volkov knew they were outmatched. As he fought to stay alive and complete the mission, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much, much worse. On the bridge of the Shadow Strike, Jeffrey stared at the viewscreen, his face ashen. The nightmarish visions that had plagued his crew were coalescing into a horrifying realization. "Sir, the psychic emanations, they're not random. They're deliberate, targeted," Lieutenant Chen said, her voice trembling. "Something is trying to break into our minds." Jeffrey's grip tightened on the armrest. The Overmind. That's what Ghost was trying to warn us about. It's been manipulating the Pakleds, using them as pawns. A chill ran through the bridge crew as the implications sank in. The Planet Killer wasn't just a weapon of mass destruction. It was a tool for harvesting the psychic energy of entire civilizations, fueling the Overmind's insatiable hunger for power. In the bowels of the Pakled space station, Volkov and his team fought with desperate fury against the alien Pakled hybrid. Plasma bolts seared the air, illuminating the grotesque features of the monster as it lunged at the humans with terrifying speed and strength. Private Ivanov screamed as a razor-sharp claw tore through his combat armor, spraying blood across the deck. Sergeant Petrova leaped forward, driving her combat knife into the creature's eye socket. The hybrid shrieked in agony, thrashing wildly as it tried to dislodge the blade. Volkov seized the opportunity, emptying his rifle's power cell into the monster's chest. The creature convulsed and collapsed, its body dissolving into a puddle of noxious ichor. But the victory was short-lived. As the team pressed forward, they found the power core chamber guarded by a horde of the monstrous hybrids, their numbers far too great to overcome. Volkov's heart sank as he surveyed the carnage. Half his team lay dead or dying, their blood mingling with the viscous fluids leaking from the slain abominations. They were out of time, out of options. With a heavy heart, Volkov made his decision. "Petrova, Sokolov, get the wounded back to the extraction point. I'll stay behind and trigger the self-destruct." Petrova shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No, sir, we won't leave you." Volkov clasped her shoulder, his voice firm but gentle. "That's an order, Sergeant. The mission comes first, always." As his team retreated, Volkov fought his way to the control panel, his armor battered and scorched by the relentless onslaught of the hybrids. With a final burst of strength, he slammed his fist down on the activation switch. Klaxons blared as the self-destruct sequence initiated. Volkov closed his eyes, a sense of peace washing over him as the world erupted in a blinding flash of light. From the bridge of the Shadow Strike, Jeffrey watched in stunned silence as the space station vanished in a massive explosion, the shockwave buffeting the ship and sending tremors through the hull. The Planet Killer was destroyed, but at a terrible cost, and with the revelation of the Overmind's existence, Jeffrey knew that the true battle was only just beginning. He turned to his crew, his voice heavy with the weight of the task before them. "Send word to Earth and our allies in the Council. We need to prepare for what's coming. The Overmind won't rest until it has consumed everything in its path." As the bridge crew set to work, Jeffrey stared out at the stars, a sense of grim determination settling over him. They had won a battle, but the war for the very soul of the galaxy had only just begun. In the somber silence that followed the destruction of the Pakled space station, Jeffrey wasted no time in his pursuit of answers. He ordered the Shadow Strike to set course for the Galactic Council's headquarters, a sense of urgency propelling him forward. As the ship navigated through the void, Jeffrey pored over the data recovered from the station, searching for any clue that might shed light on the Overmind's nature. It was Lieutenant Chen who made the breakthrough, her eyes widening as she called out, "Captain, I think I found something." Jeffrey hurried to her station, leaning in to study the display. Chen pointed to a series of glyphs, eerily similar to those they had encountered on the station. These markings, they're not just decorative, they're a language, an ancient one. She tapped a few commands, and the computer began to translate the alien script. Geoffrey's breath caught in his throat as he read the words that appeared on the screen. The Overmind. It's not just a being, it's a force of nature, a cosmic entity that has existed since the dawn of time. As they delved deeper into the translation, a chilling picture began to emerge. The Overmind, it seemed, was a parasite, feeding on the psychic energy of entire civilizations. It would manipulate and corrupt, driving its victims to war and destruction, until nothing remained but a husk drained of all life. The implications were staggering. If the Overmind had its way, the galaxy would be nothing more than a feeding ground, a cycle of destruction and rebirth played out on a cosmic scale. Geoffrey's thoughts were interrupted by a hail from the Galactic Council. As he stepped onto the bridge, he was greeted by a scene of chaos. The council chamber was in an uproar, representatives shouting over each other in a cacophony of fear and anger. "The Overmind is coming for us all," one councillor cried, his voice shrill with panic. "We must appease it, offer it tribute before it's too late." Another slammed his fist on the table, his face contorted with rage. "Appease it? Are you mad? We must fight, rally our forces and strike at the heart of this abomination." Geoffrey's voice cut through the din, calm and resolute. "Councillors, please, we must not give in to fear. The Overmind thrives on division and chaos. We must stand united if we hope to defeat it." As the debate raged on, a new alarm sounded throughout the chamber. The Pack-led fleet, it seemed, had launched a fresh wave of attacks, targeting key council worlds with ruthless precision. Reports flooded in, each more dire than the last. Planets burned, their populations slaughtered or enslaved by the Overmind's thralls. The Council, paralyzed by indecision, could only watch in horror as the galaxy slipped further into darkness. It was then that Geoffrey received the message, a secret transmission from an unexpected source. Keed, the Pack-led ambassador who had once mocked humanity's efforts, appeared on the screen, his face haggard and his eyes haunted. "Captain Warren," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know we have had our differences, but I come to you now as an ally. There are those among my people who resist the Overmind's control, who fight against its influence." Geoffrey leaned forward, his interest piqued. Keed continued, "I have information, vital intelligence that could turn the tide of this war, but I cannot share it over an open channel. You must meet me in person, on a remote planet far from the eyes of the Overmind." Geoffrey hesitated, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. He knew it could be a trap, a ploy to lure him away from the safety of his ship, but he also knew that if there was even a chance that Keed was telling the truth, he had to take it. With a heavy heart, Geoffrey made his decision. He would go to the meeting alone and hear what the Pack-led had to say. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and he would do whatever it took to see it through. Geoffrey steeled himself as the Shadow Strike's shuttle descended through the alien planet's atmosphere. Lieutenant Chen and Ensign Mikhailov, two of his most trusted crew members, sat beside him, their faces grim. As they broke through the cloud cover, the planet's surface came into view, and Geoffrey's breath caught in his throat. The landscape was a nightmarish twist of organic structures and pulsating energy fields. Twisted spires of dark, chitinous material rose from the ground, their surfaces etched with pulsing veins of sickly green light. The very air seemed to hum with an unseen power, setting Geoffrey's teeth on edge. The shuttle touched down on a rocky outcropping, and Geoffrey led his team out into the alien environment. The ground beneath their feet felt spongy and yielding, as if they were walking on living flesh. "Stay sharp," Geoffrey said, his hand resting on the butt of his plasma pistol. "We don't know what we're dealing with here." They made their way towards the coordinates Keed had provided, picking their way through the twisted landscape. As they walked, Geoffrey couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, as if the very planet itself was aware of their presence. Suddenly, a figure emerged from behind a jagged rock formation. Geoffrey's hand tightened on his weapon, but he relaxed slightly as he recognized Keed's distinctive features. The Pack-led ambassador was flanked by a group of armed rebels, their faces lined with grim determination. "Captain Warren," Keed said, his voice strained. "Thank you for coming. We don't have much time." Jeffrey nodded, motioning for his team to follow as Keed led them towards a towering structure that seemed to grow from the very bedrock of the planet. As they approached, Jeffrey saw that the structure was not a natural formation, but rather a construct of the same dark organic material that made up the rest of the planet's surface. "This is a sacred site of the ancient race that created the Overmind," Kide explained, his voice hushed with reverence. "Within this temple lies an artifact of immense power, a living machine that we believe holds the key to defeating the Overmind once and for all." Jeffrey frowned, a sense of unease settling in the pit of his stomach. Something about this place felt wrong, as if they were trespassing on forbidden ground. As they entered the temple, Cade led them through a series of twisting corridors, the walls pulsing with the same sickly light that suffused the planet's surface. Finally, they emerged into a vast chamber, dominated by a pulsating mass of organic technology that seemed to writhe and twist with a life of its own. "Behold," Cade said, his voice trembling with awe, "the heart of the ancients, the key to our salvation." As Cade began to explain the artifact's origins and potential, Jeffrey sensed a growing unease among his team. Chen's face was pale, her eyes darting nervously around the chamber. Mikhailov's hand had drifted to his weapon, his fingers twitching on the trigger guard. And then one by one they began to experience the strange phenomena. Whispers in the dark, shadows moving of their own accord, a creeping sense of dread that threatened to overwhelm them. Jeffrey opened his mouth to give the order to fall back, but before he could speak, a massive energy surge erupted from the artifact. A blinding light filled the chamber, engulfing Keed and the pack-led rebels. Jeffrey threw up a hand to shield his eyes, his skin crawling with the sensation of raw alien power. When the light faded, Jeffrey lowered his hand, blinking away the after-images that danced across his vision. What he saw made his blood run cold. The pack-led rebels were gone, replaced by twisted, nightmarish creatures that bore only a faint resemblance to their former selves. Their flesh had been warped and mutated, their bodies fused with the same organic technology that made up the temple. They let out a chorus of inhuman shrieks and began to advance on Jeffrey and his team, their movements jerky and unnatural. "Fall back," Jeffrey shouted, his plasma pistol already in his hand. "Back to the shuttle now!" They fought their way back through the temple, the transformed pack-leds in hot pursuit. Chen and Mikhailov laid down a blistering barrage of covering fire, their weapons tearing through the creature's twisted flesh. But for every one that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place, their numbers swelling with each passing moment. As they burst out of the temple and into the planet's harsh light, Jeffrey's heart sank. The shuttle was a smoking ruin, its hull torn open by some unseen force. They were trapped on this nightmare world, with no way out. But then, a figure emerged from the wreckage of the shuttle. It was Cade, his clothing torn and his face streaked with blood, but alive and untransformed. Jeffrey felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. As Cade stumbled towards them, his movements erratic and his eyes wild, Jeffrey felt a growing sense of unease. "We have to get out of here," Cade babbled, his voice high and strained. "The artifact, it's not what we thought. It's a trap, a conduit for the Overmind's power. We've been deceived, all of us." Jeffrey grabbed Cade by the shoulders, trying to steady him. "Cade, listen to me. We need to find a way off this planet. Do you understand? Do you know of any other ships? Any other way out?" But Cade just shook his head, his eyes darting back and forth like a trapped animal. "There's no escape," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Overmind sees all, knows all. We're just pawns in its game, Captain. Just pawns." As the transformed pack-leds closed in around them, Jeffrey felt a growing sense of despair. They had come to this planet seeking a weapon against the Overmind, but instead they had found only a trap, a conduit for its power. And now, with Cade's behavior growing increasingly erratic and suspicious, Jeffrey was forced to confront the possibility that his supposed ally was no longer the man he claimed to be, but rather another pawn in the Overmind's sinister game. The shadow strike hung in the void, its hull scarred and battered from the narrow escape from the nightmarish planet. In the dimly lit conference room, Geoffrey and his team gathered, their faces drawn and haunted by the horrors they had witnessed. Lieutenant Chen, her hands trembling slightly, brought up a holographic display of the data they had managed to extract from the alien artifact. "Captain, the energy signatures we detected, they're not just on the Pakled worlds, they're everywhere." Geoffrey leaned forward, his eyes scanning the glowing web of connections that spread across the galaxy. His heart sank as he saw the tendrils of the Overmind's influence reaching into the very heart of the Galactic Council. "It's worse than we thought," he said, his voice grave. "The Overmind's corruption has spread to the highest levels of our government. It explains why the Council has been so erratic, so easily outmaneuvered by the Pakleds." A murmur of unease rippled through the room. Ensign Mikhailov, his face pale, spoke up. "What do we do, sir? How do we fight an enemy that's already inside our own ranks?" Geoffrey's jaw tightened. "We root them out, we lure them into the open." He brought up a star map, zooming in on the Pakled Empire's central command. "We use the Shadow Strike stealth technology to infiltrate their headquarters. We gather the intel we need to expose the Overmind's agents and cut off its influence at the source." As the team began to plan the operation, Keed lurked in the shadows, his eyes glittering with malice. He stepped forward, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're a fool, Captain," he sneered. "You think you can outsmart the Overmind. It sees all, knows all. Your pathetic resistance is futile." Geoffrey's eyes narrowed. "I'd rather die fighting than live as a slave to that abomination." He'd laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You may get your wish soon enough." In the days that followed, tensions on the Shadow Strike reached a boiling point. Keed's behavior grew increasingly erratic, his challenges to Geoffrey's authority more blatant and disruptive. Crew members reported strange malfunctions and accidents, each one more inexplicable than the last. And then, in a moment of shocking violence, the sabotage reached its climax. Explosions ripped through the Shadow Strike's engine room, sending the ship careening out of control. Alarms blared as the crew scrambled to contain the damage and restore power to the crippled vessel. In the chaos, Geoffrey confronted Kaid, his hand hovering over his sidearm. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. Keed's face twisted into a grotesque mockery of a smile. "I've shown you the true power of the Overmind," he hissed. "Your ship is crippled, your crew demoralized. You're nothing but a pawn in a game far beyond your comprehension." Geoffrey's eyes widened as the realization hit him. You're one of them, an agent of the Overmind." Kaid's laughter echoed through the corridor. "I am but a servant of the true master. The Overmind's reach extends far beyond the Pakleds, Captain. It has seeded its agents throughout the galaxy, waiting for the moment to strike. And now, with your ship at its mercy, that moment has come." Geoffrey's mind raced as he weighed his options. The Shadow Strike was vulnerable, its defenses compromised. Kaid and the Overmind's influence threatened to overwhelm them all. He had to act fast, to make a decision that could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. Geoffrey's fingers flew across the Shadow Strike's navigation console, inputting the coordinates for the secret rally point. The ship shuddered as it tore open a rift in space-time, the stars streaking past the viewports in a dizzying blur. "Engaging emergency jump," Lieutenant Chen announced, her voice tight with tension. "Destination Resistance Base Omega." The crew braced themselves as the ship hurtled through the swirling vortex, the inertial dampeners straining to compensate for the immense forces at play. Seconds later, the Shadow Strike emerged from the jump, the twisted wreckage of a once thriving space station filling the viewscreen. "What the hell?" Ensign Mikhailov breathed, his eyes wide with disbelief. Geoffrey leaned forward, his brow furrowed. The base hung in space like a gutted carcass, its outer hull torn open and exposing the inner corridors to the vacuum of space. Debris and frozen corpses drifted in a macabre orbit around the ruined structure. "Scan for life signs," Geoffrey ordered, his voice grim. Chen's fingers danced across her console, her face pale in the flickering light of the displays. I'm picking up a few scattered readings, sir, but they're not right. Geoffrey's jaw tightened. Prep a boarding party. We need to find out what happened here. Minutes later, Geoffrey and a team of heavily armed Marines materialized in the base's main hangar, their suits sealed against the cold emptiness of space. The hangar was a scene of utter chaos, with shattered ships and mangled equipment strewn across the deck. As they picked their way through the debris, a movement caught Geoffrey's eye. A figure stumbled out from behind a ruined shuttle, its movements jerky and uncoordinated. Geoffrey raised his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Identify yourself," he called out, his voice amplified by his suit's external speakers. The figure lurched forward, its face coming into view. Geoffrey's breath caught in his throat. It was Commander Hawkins, the base's commanding officer, but something was terribly wrong. Hawkins' eyes were milky white, his skin mottled and grey. His mouth hung open in a silent scream, a thin line of drool running down his chin. "Hawkins, what happened here?" Geoffrey demanded, his heart pounding in his chest. But Hawkins didn't respond. Instead, he lunged forward, his hands outstretched like claws. Geoffrey fired the plasma bolt, searing through Hawkins's chest and sending him sprawling to the deck. "Sir, look!" one of the Marines cried out, pointing towards the far end of the hangar. A horde of shambling figures emerged from the shadows, their faces twisted in the same rictus of horror as Hawkins. They moved with a single purpose, their eyes fixed on the boarding party. "Fall back," Geoffrey ordered, his voice tight with fear. "Back to the ship, now!" The Marines laid down a blistering barrage of covering fire as they retreated, the plasma bolts tearing through the advancing horde. But for every one that fell, two more seemed to take its place, their numbers swelling with each passing moment. As they raced through the base's eerie, twisted corridors, Geoffrey's mind reeled with the implications of what they had seen. The Overmind's influence had spread even here, to the very heart of the resistance. No place was safe. No one could be trusted. Suddenly a voice crackled over the comms, distorted and barely audible. "Captain Warren, do you read me? This is Dr. Samir Patel." Geoffrey's heart skipped a beat. Dr. Patel was a brilliant scientist, a pioneer in the field of psychic research. He had been Geoffrey's mentor at the academy, a father figure in a time when Geoffrey had needed one most. But Patel had died years ago, lost in a tragic accident during a top-secret experiment. "Dr. Patel," Geoffrey asked, his voice shaking, "how is this possible?" "There's no time to explain," Patel replied, his voice urgent. "You must come to the research wing, sub-level 6. I have information vital to our survival." Geoffrey hesitated, his instincts warring with his desire to trust his old friend. But in the end he knew he had no choice. "Acknowledged. We're on our way." As they descended into the depths of the base, the horrors they encountered only grew more unsettling. Strange, pulsating growths covered the walls, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. They passed through abandoned laboratories filled with shattered equipment and ominous glowing tanks. Their contents long since escaped. Finally they reached sub-level 6, the heart of the base's research division. The corridors here were dark and silent, the only sound the echoing of their footsteps on the metal deck. Geoffrey and his team approached a set of heavy blast doors, their surfaces etched with strange alien glyphs. As they drew closer, the doors hissed open, revealing a cavernous chamber beyond. In the center of the room stood a towering machine, a nightmarish fusion of organic and mechanical components. Pulsing veins of energy snaked across its surface, and a sickly green light emanated from its core. And there, standing before the machine, was Dr. Patel, but he was not as Geoffrey remembered him. His skin was pale and waxy, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. When he spoke, his voice echoed with 1,000 whispers, as if a multitude of minds were speaking through him. "Welcome, Captain Warren," Patel said, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "I have been waiting for you." Geoffrey raised his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. "What is this, Doctor? What have you done?" Patel spread his arms wide, gesturing to the machine behind him. This is the future, Captain. The Overmind's grand design. For eons, it has sought a way to transcend the limitations of the physical realm, to merge with all life in the galaxy, and now, at last, it has found the key. He pointed to Jeffrey, his eyes blazing with a fanatical light. You, Captain Warren, you are the catalyst, the being of immense psychic potential that the Overmind requires. With your power, it will be able to achieve its ultimate goal, the creation of a singular unified consciousness that will span the stars. Jeffrey shook his head, his mind reeling with the implications of Patel's words. You're insane, Doctor. I won't be a part of this madness. Patel's smile only widened. You have no choice, Captain. The process has already begun. Even now, the Overmind's influence spreads through your mind, reshaping your thoughts and desires. Soon, you will be one with it, and together, we will usher in a new age of existence. Suddenly, the chamber shook with a massive explosion, sending debris raining down from the ceiling. Jeffrey spun around, his eyes widening as he saw Kaid standing in the doorway, a detonator clutched in his hand. Run, Captain! Kaid shouted, his face contorted with pain. I've overloaded the base's reactors. This whole place is going to blow. Jeffrey hesitated, torn between his desire to confront Patel and the need to escape. But in the end, survival won out. He turned to his team, his voice harsh with urgency. Back to the ship now. Move! They raced through the crumbling corridors, dodging falling debris and the grasping hands of the Overmind's thralls. Behind them, the research wing collapsed in on itself, the machine at its heart exploding in a blinding flash of light. As they burst into the hangar, Jeffrey saw the Shadow Strike waiting for them, its engines already spooling up for launch. They leaped aboard, sealing the airlock behind them, just as another explosion rocked the base. On the bridge, Jeffrey collapsed into his chair, his mind reeling with the revelations of the past few hours. He knew now the true nature of the threat they faced, the terrible purpose behind the Overmind's machinations. And he knew that he was the key to it all, the catalyst that could either save the galaxy or condemn it to an eternity of servitude. As the Shadow Strike tore away from the dying base, Jeffrey stared out at the stars, a grim determination settling over him. They had been tested and they had survived, but the true battle was still to come, and only time would tell if they would be strong enough to face the horrors that awaited them. The Shadow Strike hurtled through the void, its hull groaning under the strain of the anomalous forces that buffeted the ship. On the bridge, Jeffrey gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles white as he stared into the swirling maelstrom of the galactic core. Around him, the remnants of his crew worked frantically to keep the ship intact, their faces drawn and haggard. They had all seen too much, endured too much, in their desperate quest to confront the Overmind. Suddenly, the ship lurched violently, throwing Jeffrey from his seat. He crashed to the deck, his head slamming against the cold metal. As he struggled to his feet, a wave of vertigo washed over him, and the bridge seemed to melt away, replaced by a nightmarish landscape of twisted flesh and pulsating biomechanical structures. "Captain!" Lieutenant Chen shouted, her voice distant and distorted. "The Overmind, it's in our minds!" Jeffrey shook his head, trying to clear the visions that assaulted his senses. He saw his crew, their faces contorted in agony as they battled their own inner demons. Ensign Mikhailov clawed at his eyes, screaming as unseen horrors tore at his sanity. Dr. Nakamura, the ship's medic, huddled in a corner, whimpering as she relived some unspeakable trauma from her past. And then, through the chaos and the madness, a figure emerged. It was Volkov, his face pale and ghostly, his eyes haunted by a terrible knowledge. "Captain," he said, his voice a whisper that cut through the din, "you must listen to me. The Overmind's weakness, it's within you, your psychic potential, the power that the entity seeks to exploit. It's the key to its undoing." Jeffrey stared at the spectre of his fallen comrade, a sense of grim understanding dawning on him. He remembered the experiments, the tests that had hinted at his latent abilities, the whispers of a destiny that he had long sought to ignore. "What must I do?" he asked, his voice raw and hoarse. Volkov's ghost smiled. a sad, knowing smile. Embrace it, Captain. Embrace the power within you. Turn the Overmind's own weapons against it. Only then can you hope to break its hold on the galaxy. As suddenly as it had appeared, the vision faded, and Geoffrey found himself back on the bridge of the Shadow Strike. His crew, shaken but determined, looked to him for guidance, for the strength to carry on. Geoffrey stood tall, his eyes blazing with a newfound resolve. He knew now what he had to do, the sacrifice he would have to make to save everything he held dear. "Helm," he said, his voice steady and clear. "Set course for the Overmind's world. We end this once and for all." The Shadow Strike plunged into the heart of the galactic core, a tiny speck of defiance against the overwhelming darkness that threatened to engulf the galaxy. As they approached the Overmind's lair, the ship was beset by a legion of the entity's thralls, warped and twisted versions of the beings they had once known. Pakled warlords, their bodies fused with grotesque cybernetic enhancements, hurled themselves at the Shadow Strike's shields, their weapons blazing with unholy energy. Galactic Council members, their minds shattered and remade in the Overmind's image, rammed their own ships against the human vessel, heedless of their own destruction. On the bridge, Geoffrey and his crew fought with a desperate fury, pouring every ounce of their skill and determination into the battle. They knew that this was their last stand, their final chance to strike a blow against the entity that had haunted their every waking moment. As the Shadow Strike carved a path through the Overmind's defenses, Geoffrey felt a growing pressure in his mind, a sense of the entity's vast, incomprehensible presence bearing down upon him. He gritted his teeth, focusing every fiber of his being on the task at hand. And then, with a final devastating salvo, the Shadow Strike broke through, its hull battered and scorched, its weapons depleted. They had reached the heart of the Overmind's domain, a cavernous chamber pulsing with a sickly, malevolent energy. Geoffrey stood before the view-screen, his eyes locked on the writhing mass of the Overmind itself. It was a thing of pure psychic force, a being beyond the comprehension of any mortal mind. But Geoffrey was no ordinary mortal. He closed his eyes, reaching deep within himself, tapping into the wellspring of power that had always been there, waiting to be unleashed. He felt the Overmind's presence, its vast alien consciousness pressing against his own. But instead of recoiling, he embraced it, letting the entity's power flow through him, channeling it, shaping it to his will. And with a final devastating burst of psychic energy, Geoffrey unleashed the full might of his mind, a cataclysmic blast that tore through the Overmind's defenses, shattering its hold on the galaxy. The Shadow Strike shuddered and bucked, its hull cracking under the strain of the psychic maelstrom. Consoles exploded in showers of sparks, and crew members screamed as their minds were overwhelmed by the raw, unbridled power that surged through the ship. In the heart of the storm, Geoffrey stood tall, his eyes blazing with a fierce, unearthly light. He poured every ounce of his strength, every shred of his will, into the struggle, knowing that this was the moment that would decide the fate of the galaxy. And then, with a final shattering burst of energy, the Overmind's presence vanished, its hold on the galaxy broken at last. The Shadow Strike, battered and broken, drifted in the void, its crew lying silent and still on the decks. Geoffrey, his mind shattered, his body a ruin, lay at the center of the carnage, a faint smile playing across his lips. He had won, but at a terrible cost, sacrificing everything he was for one chance to save the galaxy. In the aftermath of the battle, as the remnants of the Galactic Council struggled to rebuild, Geoffrey's name was spoken with reverence and awe. He was a hero, a savior, a legend whose deeds would be remembered for generations. But for Geoffrey himself, there was no solace, no comfort in the accolades. He retreated into seclusion, a broken shell of the man he had once been, haunted by the memories of all he had lost, all he had sacrificed. And deep within the shattered recesses of his mind, a tiny spark of the Overmind flickered and danced, a reminder that even in defeat, the entity's essence endured, waiting for the chance to be reborn. If you finished this story, please subscribe and like the video. Then leave a comment that says, "I liked the story," and I will heart every single one of them. It really helps me. Thank you for your time.